In this lesson, we'll start to build out the actual form that the user will use to provide their credentials. We'll begin with the form elements that are common for both the login mode and the registration mode, and that is an input field for the user's email address and a password field for the user's password. Later on in this section, we'll also add a field for the user to confirm their password, but we'll only render that field when the user is in the registration mode. But for now, let's begin with the elements that the two modes will share. So first up, I'm going to scroll down below here, and right where we have our button right here, this will eventually be our form submission button. Right now, it's the one that says either register or log into account. That's going to be our form submission button. So I'm going to wrap that button in a form tag. So I'll begin with form right here, take the closing tag, put it below the button. And as I mentioned, we're going to want two elements here. We're going to want an input for the email and an input for the password. And for each one, I'm also going to provide a label because that is going to allow us to talk about a little caveat of React when dealing with input fields. So let's begin with a label. And I'm just going to write the text email address here. And below that, I will render a self-closing input, and I'll just give it the type of text. You could technically give it the type of email, I believe, but for now, text should be sufficient. And down below here, I will add another label, and this one will be for the user's password. And after that, I will render an input as well, but this one is going to have a type of password. All right, so if I save this, we should see these two labels appear. We don't have any styles yet on the input, but we will add them shortly. All right. So what I want to talk about right now is a very special attribute in HTML and in JSX, and it is the for attribute. So typically, whenever you have this kind of setup where you have a label for each input, it's a really good idea to give the label a for attribute and give it some kind of value that is equal to the ID attribute for the given input. That basically associates the label and the input together such that the user can click on the label and be taken directly to the input. There's also additional benefits when it comes to things like accessibility, which means rendering the website and the form for users who might not be using a traditional web browser, but instead might be using something like a screen reader. Regardless, this is a practice that is very common going back all the way to original HTML. There's just one little problem with this approach, and that is in React, we cannot use for right here as our attribute. And the reason for this is very similar to the reason why we need to use class name right here instead of class. And that is because we are dealing with reserved JavaScript keywords. Remember, this JSX is just an illusion because under the hood, this becomes regular JavaScript code. And obviously, if we have a keyword or attribute like class, that becomes problematic because that is a reserved keyword in JavaScript. And there's always the possibility for JavaScript to misinterpret that and treat it not as an attribute to this HTML element or this JSX element, but to interpret it as the literal JavaScript class keyword. The same issue applies to the for keyword. The for keyword is one of JavaScript's reserved keywords. For example, you could think of something like a for loop, right? You would simply write for like so, right? That is a reserved keyword in JavaScript. So for that reason, this is one of those rare cases where we have to provide a different name for this specific HTML attribute of for. It's the exact same way that we have to provide class name instead of class in React. For, we have to provide HTML for. So a little bit of a difference there. The F in for is capitalized and the full attribute name is HTML4. That is how the React team created this alternative attribute. Now, when this JSX becomes regular browser elements, don't worry, it's still going to be the regular for attribute. This is just the way we need to write it in JSX to avoid any conflicts with JavaScript's for keyword. When it becomes part of the browser's elements, it's going to be the regular for attribute that we're all used to. All right, so I'm going to give this a value of email, which means I need to provide the ID here, the exact same thing, email. And then I'm going to provide some light styles as well to this input. So right here, I'm going to add a class name. I'm going to add a whole bunch of Tailwind classes. So I'm going to start by giving it H8 for height. That's going to be 32 pixels of height. I want to make sure it occupies the full width of its parent, so I will do W full. I want to give it a rounded shape, so I'll do the rounded CSS class. I will give it a border with border. I will make sure the border is solid with border solid. Then for the border color, I'm going to do border-gray-300. That's another available class. I'm going to add a bunch of padding on both the X and Y axis. So for the X axis, I'm going to do PX. That means padding X, so padding on the left and right. And I'm going to do PX3. You can see that's going to be 0.75 rem, which I think is 12 pixels on the left and right side. And I'm going to do a little bit more padding on the top and bottom. So with the PY classes padding on the Y-axis, I'm going to do PY5. So a little bit more padding there. And then finally, I'm going to add a little bit of spacing between the two inputs by adding a little bit of margin on the bottom of this input, which I will do with MB. That is short for margin bottom. And I'm going to do MB4. All right. So immediately, I'm going to just copy this class name and give it to my password field below as well, because the styles are going to be very similar. And now all that's left is to apply the exact same logic as we did for the input above to the input below. So once again, I'm going to do HTML4 here because we cannot use the for attribute anymore. We are in JSX. It looks a lot like HTML, but remember, it's JSX. I'm going to give this a value of password, which means for the ID attribute of the input, we're also going to give that a value of password as well. All right, so starting to take shape. You can see the beginnings of the form on the right-hand side. We have our email address and we have our password. You'll notice as I toggle between our two modes, the inputs aren't changing, and that's because there's no reason for them to change, right? Only this text is dynamic and this text is dynamic. And so we've explored the idea of using React to render differences in things like the actual text content on the screen. But later on in these lessons, we're going to see how we can use React to be even more dynamic by rendering, for example, specific HTML elements in some condition, but not another. All right, but this moves us forward. We now have a basic form ready to go, and I will see you in the next lesson.